So welcome, Richard Kahlenberg. We're so happy that you agreed to come back and visit with us tonight. For you, any of you tuning in or listening later, we had the great honor 10 years ago of having Richard join us when we first got started as Great Schools in Wake, and later we became Public Schools First NC, or we grew into a larger statewide organization. But Richard was here 10 years ago when we were very concerned about what was going on in public education in Wake County in North Carolina. We were very concerned about keeping our schools diverse and integrated, high quality, well funded. And so Richard came down and worked with us, and along with Gerald Grant, who wrote that wonderful book about North Carolina and Wake County, Wake County where there are no bad schools. And so in our 10th year and a celebration this year, we invited Richard to come back once more and to share with us some of the issues, some of his research and some of the things that he's looked at in terms of school integration and privatization. So at the conference, which was just our kind of launching of this topic for the next year and talking about it and getting people's attention, we invited each of the panelists to come back for a detailed conversation on their own. And so you're so kind to do that. I wanted to just to remind all of you, if you haven't had a chance, I've jumped ahead too far here because I am not good at this, and my public understands that I'm jumping ahead here. But Richard is the director of K-12 Equity. He's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He has been called the intellectual father of economic integration movement in K-12 schooling. You can read here about some of his publications and books, but the thing that I will say about Richard is that he's taken a variety of looks over the years, and he's been on probably all sides and many sides, and he's really at heart cared deeply about making sure that our public education system is strong and that it serves all children. And we know that that is a controversial topic many times, but that we keep looking for a conversation and ways that we can improve. By trade, Richard is very much the writer and the researcher now, but he is also a lawyer by trade from the Harvard Law School. And Richard, what else do you want to tell us about yourself before we jump in tonight? Is there, what formed your thinking? How did you get involved from being a law student to getting involved so deeply at being one of the premier researchers in the area of K-12 equity?
Well, first of all, Yvonne, thanks so much for having me. I admire the work that you've done in North Carolina for so many years, so it's wonderful to be with you tonight. So I got interested in education basically as a matter of fairness. In this country, we don't have a large social welfare state. We really look to the public schools as a place where we're going to provide everyone an equal shot. And there's a broad, I think, bipartisan consensus that that's what public education should be about. Public schools should provide social mobility for people who are disadvantaged and provide opportunities for everyone, and also social cohesion. So bringing children of different backgrounds together and teaching them what it means to be an American. And that was what motivated me to do this work after law school. I decided not to practice law because I was more interested in what the law should be than applying what it is. So I just began reading the research and found that one of the best things we can do for kids is give them an opportunity to go to high quality, integrated public schools. And so that's what I've been writing about and researching for about more than 20 years.
Well, and so that leads us to just kind of starting this conversation. And a lot of people ask me, and this is just a limited explanation of what school privatization is, but it's really what we've seen is this big shift from public education funds and students being in the public sector over to the private sector. And that comes in a variety of ways. But maybe share with everyone kind of the perspective or the view you're going to use for your presentation tonight to talk about what this movement or this of school privatization is, and then I think that'll take us right into your research.
Yeah. Well, I'm deeply concerned about what we're seeing at the federal level with Secretary DeVos, who's really pushing this privatization agenda, where the idea is, the theory is that students will do better in private schools. There's no good evidence to suggest that's true. The public schools have served us well for generations. Private schools tend to balkanize us, so that people go to schools, based on religion or sometimes based on race, and they don't serve that purpose of bringing kids of different backgrounds together. So I'm very concerned about the movement towards private school vouchers. I know, unfortunately, that's a big problem you've got in North Carolina. You're one of the poster children for what can go wrong when we privatize the public system. But most people know that 90% of American students go to public schools. People believe in public schools. So I think we're certainly on the side of public opinion when we support high quality public schools.
So let's talk a little bit about what some of the things that you talked about at the conference, which is, so what is the goal? Why do we care about privatization so much, and what do we see that it's doing? As we said in our earlier slide, in North Carolina and across the country, some of the movements towards shifting kids and funds into private schools has led to a lot of segregation by race and income in our schools. And so let's talk a little bit about the benefits of having diversity, and I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Yvonne. So really, there are two big benefits to school integration by socioeconomic status and also by race. The first benefit is that all students learn more when they have the opportunity to interact with classmates of different backgrounds. So everyone benefits when those different perspectives are brought to the school. And the second issue is that there are well-documented harms that come from segregation, particularly economic segregation, where you have concentrations of poverty, where there are large numbers of low-income students bringing a lot of needs that are packed into particular schools. So I want to be clear here when I talk about concentrations of poverty, though, that in no way am I suggesting that low-income kids can't learn. It's quite the opposite. That low-income students, they can do amazing things if given the right environment. But we know from a half century of research that concentrating the poverty in certain schools is not the way to provide genuine equal opportunity.
Right.
So we can go to the next slide, please. So I can take each of those in turn. The first is the benefits for all students of diversity. So this is middle-class students, white students, African-American students, Latino students, low-income students. Everyone benefits when they experience a classroom where students of different backgrounds are present. So there's a long line of research now finding, in essence, that diversity makes us smarter.
Wow.
That when you have those different perspectives in the classroom, that the discussions are more interesting and lively than when everyone comes from a very similar background and may bring those similar experiences to the discussion. That you have enhanced learning when and more deeply creative solutions are found when students come from different backgrounds. That's something that's been established in higher education for a long time, and there's an analogous set of research at the K through 12 level. In addition, if we look beyond schools to what the world students are going to graduate into.
Mhm.
We know it's increasingly diverse, and that it's important to be able in the workforce to be able to get along with people of all different backgrounds. The number one reason research suggests that people are fired on the job is not that they're incompetent; it's that they can't get along with people. I mean, we all probably know of individuals like that in our own lives.
Mhm.
And a big part of that is not being able to get along with individuals who come from different racial backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. And so that's the genius of the public schools, is that when there are conscious efforts for diversity, everyone can benefit from that type of education.
And one thing that someone mentioned at the conference I wanted to add is just the impact of the parent support and the community support when you have a school that is diverse by income and by race. So you also have all the parent support. It's not just what's going on in the classroom with the teachers, but also the middle class support, the PTA, the ability for civic and PTA groups to come in and to help out. And we know that that's one of the realities of high poverty schools, is you don't have that middle class income group that can supplement and augment what's going on in the school. And
Yeah.
that's it ought to be illegal, but it's but it's real in terms of what the difference is that PTAs and middle class parents and resources they bring to a school that we just don't have in high poverty schools.
Well,
Um, so,
that's a great point, Yvonne. And to be clear, low income parents care deeply about their kids'
all right,
education.
all right.
But if they're working several jobs, if
Mm-hmm.
they don't have a car to get to the PTA meeting or the back to school night, they're not going to be able to participate in the way that more advantaged parents can. And so if you have some middle class parents in all the schools,
Right.
then every student benefits from that active parental involvement.
And volunteer hours, not just financial contributions, but the ability to, I visited an elementary school a couple of weeks ago that was very, very high poverty, and very dedicated parents who work very hard with their kids at home, but they cannot get off work and be able to support their families and come to the school and volunteer in classrooms. I went to another school almost the next day where it's a very diverse school, but a strong middle class school. And there are about 25 volunteers a day who are at that school doing things like working with kids on math and reading, working in the library, working in the classroom, helping the teacher because they don't have enough teacher assistants. And that is a really different scenario. It has nothing to do with the loving caringness of parents. It has to do with practicality of life. And those parents being able to get there. So, but I'll say one last thing about this workforce. Since you mentioned this concept at the conference about this, I started Googling it. And I found even the National Chamber of Commerce, which is traditionally a fairly conservative work group, that business supporting organization, and they listed this as one of their top issues, that people come out of the high school and more importantly come out of four-year universities and don't really understand the world, culture, social and cultural issues, how to behave in the workplace, and how to work with people who are not like them. And they actually put it on there as one of the things they're looking for when they're hiring people. So I was fascinated by that and found lots of support for what you had to say. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. But thank you for bringing that point up.
Yeah, and the business leaders in Wake County, as you well know, were important.
Right.
In suggesting let's not let the schools resegregate a decade ago, because they knew that was bad for business.
And they're still that way. When we saw they have been very supportive, and one of the biggest groups of businesses, realtors and home builders, They really love strong, diverse, integrated schools. They love our magnet school program because they want to keep Gerald Grant's dream
Yep,
true, which is there are no bad schools. And
that's
if
right.
we're putting the resources in, that shouldn't happen. But let me let you go ahead.
Sure. So just to kind of amplify this idea that every student brings something special to the classroom, one analogy that Eugene Garcia uses is that every student comes with a little suitcase of experiences. And so that might be a different language or a different background, a culture. And in the old days, teachers used to tell immigrants or students of color, you know, close that suitcase. We're not interested in what you've experienced in your background, and you're going to learn our way. Well, now educators realize that was a huge mistake, and
Huge.
instead open that suitcase so that
Hmm.
we can learn from you.
Hmm.
And that lateral learning that goes on among peers is so important, and having the ability to learn from one another is something that happens every day in integrated schools and really happens much less in segregated schools.
So how about the relationship of that comment to diversity in your teaching staff? Um, I've seen that over the last 4 or 5 years, and I've seen some things I think you've done at the Century Foundation, looking at the value of having, teachers of color, teachers who speak second languages, teachers who come from a variety of, how is that impacting what goes on with the kids?
Well, it's incredibly important. I mean, so far we've been talking about efforts to bring children of different backgrounds together, which is a hugely important first step. But then if one is successful in doing that, it's very important that children of all backgrounds see in the leadership of the
Mhm.
school, in the teaching force, a reflection of themselves. Uh, I remember in New York City a number of years ago, the teacher union leader Albert Shanker said it was very detrimental for children to see over and over again a white teacher and then a minority teaching aide, because it sent a message about a hierarchy,
Right,
the expected hierarchy in
right,
society. And we
right.
can disrupt that by having uh, diverse diverse teaching force
Mhm.
and especially leadership in schools as well. That sends a very powerful message to students.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't want to. I don't want to. I didn't want to miss that opportunity to talk about
Yes.
the workforce while we went where we were talking about the other. But so let's get back to this whole notion of concentrated poverty, because this is a really big issue in North Carolina right now. It is an issue across the state, and even in Wake County, our number of high poverty schools has increased over the last 5 years, and as we've seen the privatization movement increase, and we've seen more charter schools, more voucher programs, more virtual charters. Um, all of these combined have created a situation where we have a lot of schools that are either high SES or low SES, and where we have a lot of schools that are segregated also by race. But poverty has been a big punch in the gut for a lot of our schools right now. Um,
That's right.
so let's talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Uh, so 50 years ago, there was a study that came out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was authorized by Congress to find out, why do we have this achievement gap between African Americans and whites? Because the solution to that was going to be central to fulfilling the mission of the Civil Rights Act. And James Coleman, a sociologist, looked at thousands and thousands of students across many, many school districts and concluded that the number one predictor of how well a student would do was the economic status of the family that she comes from. And then thought that the second biggest predictor would probably be the per pupil spending or maybe racial segregation, but in fact found it was the concentrations of poverty. That was it's a disadvantage on average to come from a low income family and have those struggles and the stress that comes from that. But it's a second disadvantage, independent disadvantage, to then go to a school where all your classmates are also low income. And so we can do something about that, both of them. I mean, we can provide better, higher minimum wage and better programs to make sure that poverty is alleviated. And on top of that, through our public school system and through housing programs, we can reduce concentrations of poverty. There have been dozens and dozens of studies done since that 1966 Coleman report. The most recent was from Sean Reardon at Stanford, and he was looking at 350 million student test scores over the last 6 or 7 years, and found that there is no school district in the country that has been able to really reduce the achievement gap by race without addressing concentrated poverty and segregation. So if it were easy to just wave our wand and fix high poverty schools, we would be doing it. But researchers know that that's extremely difficult to do, and therefore we should point ourselves in the direction of what we know does work, which is providing high quality integrated schools for all students.
And the term I heard years ago, which I've never forgotten, is, and I can't remember who said it. You probably remember this because you're so much younger than me, but it was like throwing money over the wall is not going to solve the problem. Because a lot of folks talk to me as I go around the state and I do presentations. They always want to know, like, well, we need to give more money to the high poverty schools. And that is true. There are a lot of special needs that come with a high poverty school. That does often require more funding and some equity in funding adjustments. But unfortunately, for the majority of those schools, throwing that more money over the wall doesn't impact the academic performance at the end of the day in the long run. And that's what's really heartbreaking to me about segregated and high poverty schools is that, and look at this, 50 million students in this study.
Yeah.
I mean, this is startling, and how strong the data is here, that we're just, not, throwing money over the wall, so to speak, and equity funding isn't helping. It does lead one at the end of every presentation, doesn't it, Richard, to want to say, fight poverty, fight poverty, fight poverty, because because when you look at a lot of these families, their children are struggling because they're also struggling with just the impact of that. So let's go to your next slide here.
That's right. I can just add on that point.
Please.
I do support more funding for high poverty schools, as I know you do, because it can have some positive effect. But the more powerful educational intervention is to address kind of the root of the problem, which is these concentrations of poverty. So this next slide goes to that point, because oftentimes in the news media there will be encouraging stories about individual high poverty schools that have a successful, charismatic principal who brings in some great teachers, and for a short period of time, test scores go up, and we ought to study those schools and figure out how, as best we can, to replicate them. But the reality is those are the exceptions to the rule. And so if you look at schools that are consistently high performing over time, the lower poverty schools are 22 times as likely to be successful as high poverty schools. So rather than, hitting our heads against the wall and saying, let's make some small improvement in the high poverty schools, we really ought to attack the fountainhead of inequality, which is the economic and racial segregation of our schools.
Okay.
So, and we can go to the next one. Yeah. So this is a
Wow.
slide which looks at the scores on math scores on what's known as the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, and this is considered the best test out there. It's very sophisticated, and researchers almost uniformly say it's better than many of the low quality state level tests.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that low income students who go to economically mixed schools which are on the left side of the screen, are scoring substantially higher than those in the high poverty schools. And roughly, almost 20 points difference in some of these cases.
Wow.
Now, what that means in the real world is 10 points on the NAEP is equal to about a year of learning. So in fourth grade, you have low-income students who get a chance to go to economically mixed schools are about 2 years ahead of low-income students in high-poverty schools. So this is national data, and we really have to examine this issue further.
And we have similar data on North Carolina that shows the same occurrence. And when you start thinking about that, we are creating a situation in terms of how we are organizing our schools that are just making the situations and the challenges that these children and their families already have, and we're actually aiding and abetting in these kids being 1 or 2 or 3 years behind. And we know from our research, Richard, that these kids have very little chance of catching up. If you're in the fourth grade and you're already a year or two behind, by the time you hit middle school and puberty and age, many states of 16 where you can legally drop out of school, we find a lot of these kids who are low performing in the fourth and fifth grade are great risk for being unable to finish high school and in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years. And so that seems like that in a society that ignores this information is not doing itself good. Because the thing I always say to folks when they lament, oh, I'm so glad that my kid's doing okay. I'm so glad my grandchildren are doing okay. And I go, yeah, but they sit next to kids who aren't, and they live in a world with kids who aren't. And we need in America every citizen to be well educated, well trained, because they're going to take the place of you and me. They're going to take the place of the mechanics we have now, the doctors we have now, and the nurses we have now, and the cops we have now. And we need them to be well educated and well trained, and we need them to defend our democracy, right? So, so housing has a lot to do with all of this, right?
Yes.
Some of this is something that school systems have no control over.
Yeah,
A lot, right?
That's right. So the school systems don't literally have control over the housing, but our housing policy isn't doesn't come out of a vacuum.
Right.
There have been a number of housing policies put in place over the last century, which exacerbate segregation. And yet the good news is there are some innovative programs that can do some really positive things. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., they have a policy known as inclusionary zoning. And I know there are communities in North Carolina that have this as well. And so what happens in these programs is that when a builder develops a certain number of housing units, she sets aside a proportion of those units for low-income families. And so in Montgomery County, Maryland, they have that program. And then they have a second program, which is to provide extra funding in the higher poverty schools. So what's nice from a researcher's perspective is that when students and their families are assigned to public housing, they take whatever they can get. So it's a random lottery essentially because housing's so scarce. And so some low-income families were assigned to the higher poverty schools that spend extra per pupil, and others go to the middle-class schools that actually spend a little bit less per pupil, $2,000 less per pupil. And the question is, who does better? And you can see the results here. Students in the green zone, which are the middle-class schools, the low-income students in the middle-class schools, did much better over time than low-income students in the red zone schools, the higher poverty schools, even though those red zone schools were spending more. And so,
Richard, I would tell you though that in North Carolina, we do not have inclusionary zoning. It is not allowed as a tool in the toolkit. So what we have seen a few communities start doing, a few like city councils and those kind of things, is they're able to strike deals or trying to work deals out with builders, right? Like they do have some capacity to decide through zoning where different types of housing can be, right? That's a tool, right? They can say, whether you can have multi-family housing here or duplexes or single housing. So they have a lot of zoning power, and they have the ability to negotiate with builders. Would you so kindly, Richard, if you're building, if I let you, I give you a building permit to build a high-rise of 1,000 apartments, would you set aside voluntarily, set aside low incomes? And so we've had a few success cases, but overall, we're not doing so good on this. We are still have a lot of the high growth areas are in North Carolina are trending towards higher rents, higher home sales. So we're struggling. This is a struggle for us. So any advice or suggestions or anything you have, I want to pass this on to our elected officials at the local level and the state level, because this is a struggle for us. We are just like every place in America. We have historically, racially segregated housing patterns.
Right.
And then now in high growth areas, it's just made compounded in that it's become a class issue.
Yes.
It's not a race issue anymore, but it is a class issue. And so we have the historic impact of racism on income and an ability to do that. So we're in a mess. But this is encouraging. This shows very clearly that if you can, through hook or crook, integrate your schools better in terms of class, income, that you have a lot of benefits here. Because this is irregardless of race. This is simply kids who of any racial identification. If they have an opportunity for a diverse, economically diverse school, they do better. Look at this.
That's right. That's right.
It's amazing data.
They do a lot better. And just to give you one other example, in Minneapolis, they recently eliminated single-family zoning. And part of the reason they did so was they wanted to give opportunity for kids who were from families of modest means the chance to get into some of these stronger schools, because right now we've got the significant barriers. So this slide just further quantifies the benefits.
Right.
The math gap between middle-class students and low-income students was cut in half. In the economically integrated schools, the reading gap was cut by 1/3. And some of this had to do, about 1/3 of the effect had to do with living in a middle-class neighborhood. And 2/3 of the effect had to do with attending a middle-class school. So both are important. But even if you can't address the housing issue, getting the schools integrated has an enormous impact.
Has an enormous impact. And I will say that, Wake County and Charlotte, we've had some nationally recognized efforts in Swan versus the case in Charlotte, 20 years ago now, where they were court-ordered busing and diversity. And
even further, that was 1971, so it was
71.
Yes,
oh, thank
quite
you.
a while ago. But
Wow.
Charlotte was really one of the leading districts in the country, had success
Right.
with integration. And you, I'm sure, know this story that Ronald Reagan came to town and was pounding his fist about, we're opposed to busing, and no one applauded because it had
No.
actually worked.
Oh, those were the days.
Yes, but in 2016, I did work with the Charlotte Public School System to provide a socioeconomic measure for integration of the magnet schools. Not all the schools, but a substantial number. And so there is recognition that this is a problem, growing recognition this is a
Right.
problem, and some important steps are being taken.
Wake County, and I live in Wake County, so I'll give kudos to our school board in
Yes.
that they spent the first part of this decade fighting back to reverse and change and take back our school system and re-implement, diversity as one of the important components of a successful school system. And then, they have, in the meantime, had to fight all of the I call it disruptions and diversions of the General Assembly from how we're funded, how we can contract with teachers. They took away due process and tenure from teachers. They changed class size requirements. We went from like, very, 25 in school funding to like 39. So we have had a lot of things that local school systems have had to deal with, like keeping, kids in school and teachers in the classrooms. So diversity kind of got shifted to the background a little bit, right? But now I would say that Wake County is working with RTI, and they're working to kind of reinvigorate and relook at ways to reduce high poverty schools and to integrate their schools more. And of course, that Wake County is a big magnet based school, and as Charlotte is, and we could talk about that in a little bit. But I do want to let you go ahead through some of this data that you have, because it's powerful.
Sure. So this is a slide looking at Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has a system in which students choose from a variety of public schools, and then the choices are honored by the school district with an eye to making sure that the schools are socioeconomically integrated. So they've done a good job, as has Wake, of trying to bring some balance to the schools socioeconomically. And you can see that the students in Cambridge, which are the blue lines here in these figures, are graduating at a much higher rate than students in nearby Boston, which is the gray line, and higher than Massachusetts as a whole, which is the orange line. So,
Wow.
So Cambridge schools are economically integrated, and you see each subgroup graduating at almost 20 percentage points higher in some cases.
That's
For low-income students, African-American students, Hispanic students, and the white students continue to do quite well in terms of graduation rates. So it's a win-win situation.
And so it does. So I look at this and tell me if I'm okay with my analysis here. But as soon as I look at this, it's like, so this proves to me that it does, integrating our schools doesn't hurt rich kids, middle class kids. It doesn't hurt white kids. And in fact, it seems very, very much to lift them all up. All students seem to be doing better than everywhere else. And so this is a great argument for some of those parent groups that are concerned that, that their child is going to lose benefits or lose opportunities that think they're going to lose. We talk about opportunity hoarding and those kind of things. Am I right when I look at this? Is that what you see?
Yes, and that's consistent with virtually all the research suggesting that in no cases did white students see a decline in their achievement or graduation rates. So even the big opponents of integration really conceded, the researchers conceded, that there was no negative effect on white students. And in many ways, the learning is deeper and more elaborate when we have integrated schools because of the experiences that our students are bringing. So really everyone benefits.
And this is I'm going to have to save this slide, because some of the times, when I am talking with groups of parents who are concerned on both ends. I don't want my kid to have to spend this much time. I don't want my kid to be in having to travel long distances. And then on the other hand, I hear parents that say, I don't want my kids to miss opportunity. And so what I think of is, when my kids were younger, I craved every opportunity I could to give them an advantage. I wanted them to hear, to see a play, or to have a book, or to hear the symphony play for free, and in the holidays, I would take them to those things if I could, because I thought that was giving them exposure and a benefit. So I tell parents, to me, that when my kids went to integrated schools all the way through, I felt like that was a gift I was giving them. Yeah. That I gave them the gift that was just like music or arts or a book, or a chance to go to a football game. These are all experiences I wanted my kids to grow up and have, right? And so to me, that this is a gift that middle class parents, high income parents, low income parents, parents of many backgrounds could give their kids. And your data shows me that they would be helping their children and not harming them at all.
That's right. That's right. And one other thing to mention is the way in which this is cost efficient, because
taxpayers want to hear this, lawmakers want to hear it.
We all want our tax dollars to be as efficient as possible, and conservatives in particular tend to emphasize this point. Mm-hmm. But actually, going back to what we said earlier, the fact that investing extra money in high poverty schools is less successful on average than integrating underlines the point that you get more bang for the buck by integrating. And so there was an analysis done at the Century Foundation which found that investment in integration, which requires things like the creation of magnet schools with special programs and some investment in transportation to get kids to the schools, that's worth it. It pays for itself. It pays for itself over many times. So the public benefits exceed the cost by a factor of 3.3, and when you add the public and private benefits as well, the payoff is a factor of 5.5. So this is a very wise investment.
So if I was the taxpayer, a voter, 70% of the folks in North Carolina do not have kids in the public school system. So we depend on the support of all those citizens out there who don't have kids in the system. We depend on them to give us money for build schools and to fund our classrooms and to pay our teachers. So, I like to say sometimes is that we're not treating our funders, our investors. If we were running a business, which people want to try to make us do, our stockholders should be upset, right? Yeah. Because we're not maximizing the benefits. We're not getting a good return on our money. So yeah. I'm hoping that this is really good information and stuff that I wish that I could get more of our business communities kind of gets it, parents kind of get it, but we need to get that core of our voters to really invest in thinking about how can we maximize. And so you have here just another issue that is near and dear to my heart, which is, I want educated voters. I want people who understand how to make decisions and to think critically.
That's right.
Be able to determine themselves. I read an article today that the National PTA put out on helping your kids discern real information, not false data and and so forth. And a lot of that depends on kids being able to use technology and be able to read.
That's
They
right.
got to be good readers, and they got to be able to look at information and analyze it. So how
Yeah.
does that happen?
Yeah. I would say there are 2 points here. That segregated schools undermine our democracy in 2 ways. One is that our kids come out less literate and numerate and less educated when we have segregation. And so they're less able to make those decisions about whom to elect as our leaders. But the other piece is that you have to teach democratic values. It's not automatic. We don't grow up, just innately thinking democracy is
It's a good thing.
a good thing.
Mhm.
And we've seen, in fact, a rise in the number of young people who say democracy is a bad system.
Mhm.
Well, part of the problem is that segregated schools undermine the democratic message of public education. So
Mhm.
when we teach in the textbook that everyone is equal in the society, we all get an equal vote,
Mhm.
that is less compelling to kids when they look around them and see, well, why am I going to the segregated school that has fewer resources?
Right.
And it's a terrible message to the affluent kids too. They may think, well, I'm better than other kids because I go to a fancier school that has more and is higher performing. So, under integration is important for our democracy. And I used to not emphasize this as much. I would just talk about the test scores, and test scores are important.
Yes.
But I think all of us had a wake-up call a few years ago about the strength of our democracy and how we can't take it for granted. And so integrated schools improve and underline that democratic message.
Mhm.
The other thing is that when children know classmates of different backgrounds, it's much harder for a demagogue to demonize them.
Right.
You can have someone, I'll just say hypothetically, run for president and say, we're going to ban Muslims. Well, if you go to school with some of your classmates who are Muslim and you know them to be decent people, and why would we want to ban my friend who's Muslim? I mean, it's much harder for a
Right.
demagogue to scapegoat
Mhm.
certain populations when the schools
Absolutely.
are
Absolutely.
integrated.
And to understand, I have grandchildren now in school, and they're in, my youngest grandson is in a very integrated school by race and income, and I find him to be compellingly empathetic. I find him to be defensive and defending people who say, well, he doesn't have this. This kid doesn't have a coat. I mean, my grandson has given away his coat many times to
Wow.
children who don't have coats. Because he understands the impact of not having lunch money. And he understands what happens if you don't have someone to come and pick you up when you're sick. And so I'm listening to his conversations and his empathy, and I am very sure that I did not have that barometer growing up in segregated schools and in schools that were very much in the neighborhood we lived in.
Right.
So I did not have the same exposure. So I'm really concerned about, I think you make an excellent point here about how we can scapegoat people based on religion, race, income, when we don't know and we haven't been exposed, we haven't been able to see on our own what that means. And then so I love your point here, social mobility.
Yes.
That is so important, right? Because uh, hopelessness is such a devastating thing, whether it's about your life overall, or it's about why you should work hard. If you feel, there's no purpose, I can't get ahead, I can't do better. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. Well, we want
Take
social
this to this,
mobility.
to
We
this really the important point here.
Yes.
Um,
I'll just say quickly, we want social mobility for its own sake, but we also want
yeah,
it for our democracy, because if people feel like they have no hope, then again, they're more likely to be uh, susceptible to a demagogue who runs for office.
right.
So
And they're certainly not going to be as likely to be productive, right? Like
yes,
I hear people say over and over again, well, we want everyone to be a productive, tax-paying, contributing member of society. We absolutely do. And we know that public education is a vehicle that starts that person down that path, right, of educating these little souls so that they can one day be, that is the goal, isn't it? So they can be independent, contributing taxpayers and thinkers and supporters of democracy. So I love your 2 points there. They really resonate with me.
yeah. And then this next slide is kind of heartbreaking, because you see under the private school voucher program in North Carolina, that we see,
Incredible.
yeah, we see the opposite. So I reference this school with audiences across the country, but
Hmm.
it's particularly poignant to be speaking with you in North Carolina, because
Hmm.
the Fayetteville Christian School has in its handbook
Right,
explicit policies to
right,
exclude students based on religion and
right.
based on LGBT status of their parents. I mean, it's the antithesis of
Hmm.
what public education is supposed to be about. Public education is we take all comers,
Hmm.
and under our system, there is, under the First Amendment, there is a right to establish private schools. So that I have no quarrel with that.
Hmm.
But the problem is when you use public funds
Right,
to support people using private schools,
right.
as the North Carolina private school voucher program does,
Hmm.
and then those funds are used to teach anti-democratic values. It just defeats the whole purpose of why all of us are paying taxes, to educate kids in our democracy.
And in North Carolina, for the vouchers that we have, over 90%, I'm just going to say over 90% because I can't remember right now the exact percentage, but it's over 90% are going to religious affiliated schools.
Mhm.
And so this is one one school, but most of the vouchers are going to schools that have very similar statements or comments or gateways
Yes.
that maybe aren't as obvious as this one, but they are gateways nevertheless. Or they have things like interviews.
Mhm.
They have, you have to sign commitments for parent involvement of a certain number of hours, or you're going to volunteer. They have a lot of gateway activities that public schools would be illegal.
Right.
Any kids. Now, I grew up as an Army brat. I
Mhm.
traveled all over the world. And the one thing that I knew, no matter where we went, I could walk into any public school and they would have to enroll me right then.
Right.
It did not matter my age, my gender, my income, my race, my ability level.
Mhm.
We moved almost every year. And there I would be. I could go to the local school. My mom take me in. I'm registered. And this vouchers going to private schools, that's not happening.
Right.
And it's amazing. It's startling. I've had people just stop me in my tracks and say that can't be true. And I go,
Hmm.
yes, you can go take your voucher and go to a private school. But here's the other thing. This is your point is the most salient, which is the anti-democratic values. But the other point is there's no accountability for the funding. I give you the money. You don't have to tell me anything.
Hmm.
I
Yes.
don't have to know. In fact, private schools in North Carolina do not require a college education for the teachers.
Hmm.
Most of them, a lot of them do have teachers who have 4-year degrees, but they're not certified teachers, and they do not have to have, they don't have to meet that. They don't have to follow the state curriculum standards. They can pick who they want to be on their teams. they can require, and then they can push kids out
Hmm.
for
Right.
any reason
Yep.
with no due process by the parents of the kids. So it's amazing, and people can't believe it. And this is one of those tools that we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation, Richard, about, well, how are we going about this business of privatizing our public schools? This is the number one way, one of the number one, charters are the second, but across the nation where vouchers have been used, it's immediate that they're either going to schools that are very are segregated by race or by income. And then here's the other thing. A lot of the kids come back from voucher schools into the public school system. And how sad, because now they're even further behind.
Right.
So, I say to parents who are angry about the things they think their kids are getting in their schools, I'm all on board with that, and they have a right to demand that their school educates their children and that we do it right. We should all demand. But once they leave and go into a program that's not with certified teachers and not following curriculum and not teaching science, as an example, then these kids come back, and I feel so sorry for them. They've lost another year of their opportunity for their life. And so, Richard, I don't want to let you go because you have done so much work on, and I'll come back to it, but I've got 2 or 3 people here who really want you to talk about magnets. They really want to know, they don't like to see they're worried about the busing and the transportation, but they really want to know. You've worked in Charlotte, you've studied Wake. Give us some advice. They're saying, what can we do to encourage magnets? Is that the solution? Any other tools in your kit?
Yeah, I think magnets are a wonderful program for integrating schools and for meeting the individual interests and needs of particular students. So if you have a child who is wild about science, then by all means, let's create schools where children like that will flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we can locate magnets anywhere provides the opportunity to bring about this important value of economic and racial integration,
Mm-hmm.
because we find in community after community that families, and they may be quite privileged families who could send their kids anywhere. They will put their child on a bus to go to a high quality magnet school that's further away, because at the end of that bus ride is this special program in which their child will flourish. And there's a huge bonus there that they're also going to get an integrated education.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, in the 1970s, there was some significant backlash in places like Boston to school desegregation, and the whole effort kind of took a step backwards as a result. But the magnet school program provides the opportunity to integrate voluntarily, and that has proven to be quite successful. And as I was mentioning earlier, in places like Cambridge, every school is a magnet school.
Wow.
There's no reason that you can't have every school have something distinctive to offer, and therefore integrate schools through voluntary choice. So I think that's important.
Wow. I haven't thought about that. I'm glad you said that. Every school is a magnet school.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to investigate that a little bit more,
Okay.
because I'm thinking about Charlotte and Wake County, and I know that they probably have done special efforts to, and maybe they think that that's true, but I don't know that I've heard them advertise that. I think maybe they need to change their marketing here a little bit, Richard.
Mm-hmm.
That every school is high quality and is a magnet school, and everybody should apply for many of these schools, not just a small select few. Now the school choice, the word choice, parent choice. So how do magnets fit into this? And it seems like a natural fit for school systems and school boards to want to use magnets as a great way to get parent choice.
Yes, I mean, their
Mhm.
choice can be either good or bad depending on how it's implemented.
Mhm.
And so, we've talked about private school vouchers. That's a form of choice that tends to segregate us more and can spread undemocratic values. Uh, Charter schools, I would put somewhere in the middle. I think there are many, particularly in North Carolina, that are segregating us further and
Mhm.
setting us back. I think there are a small number that are diverse by design and offer some promise. But then you have magnet schools, which are really uh, probably the strongest form of public school choice
Mhm.
in the sense that they are fully accountable, and teachers have voice in those schools as well. That's not to be underestimated, because in many of the private schools and many of the charter schools, there isn't the same opportunity for teachers to have a say in how schools are run. And under most of our traditional public schools, there are mechanisms in place for teacher voice. So I wrote a
That,
biography of.
I got to stop
Okay.
you for a second and just say thank you for saying that. Because that's one of the things that I've noticed as I've visited schools in these categories over the last 10 years, being trying to observe and to get some information that's, somewhat independent, not biased. And what I've seen is a lack, and for the majority, overwhelming majority of schools that I see that are private and charter, I do not see the teacher voice. I do not see the teacher leaders. I do not see the chair of the departments. I do not see the faculty meetings where there's pushback against, the principal sometimes, and sometimes pushback against the school board. And thoughtfulness, because it's their school. And they have a procedural policy that says they have to have school-based, site-based management.
Mhm.
So they are empowered.
Right.
So I think that was a really important point that you made, and I didn't want to not acknowledge that and make sure that people are really thinking about that, what that means at their child's school.
Mhm. Well, there were three pillars to the original charter school idea that the teacher union leader Al Shanker outlined. One is they should be collaborative. There's rather than competitive with the
Mm-hmm.
traditional public schools.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to be experimental schools where the lessons would be transferred to the traditional public schools. The second is that they should be more integrated than the traditional public schools, because charter schools aren't based on neighborhoods, so they could get beyond, in theory, get beyond the
Mm-hmm.
residential segregation. And the third thing Shanker wanted was more teacher voice. And unfortunately, on all three of those things, at many charter schools, we find the opposite: more segregation, less teacher voice, and competition rather than collaboration. I will say there are some good examples, like the Morris Jeff Charter School in New Orleans is unionized, it's integrated, and it collaborates with the traditional public schools. So I don't want to say
It's
that charter
impossible.
schools are. No,
Right.
this one's in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but unfortunately, most charter schools don't fit that original Shanker model, and that's problematic.
Yeah, and in North Carolina, in our charter statute, one of the things that, the whole thing started kind of with that frame of reference, by the way, which was some teachers were really lobbying to have some schools of experimentation, and they wanted to have some of the rules loosened. They wanted the calendar. They wanted some flexibility to try different instructional strategies and to try team teaching or different class sizes. They had some really clever notions, and that has gone from that to anyone can apply to a charter. To open a charter, it's a lot of for-profit companies, businesses out of state that are coming in and operating a business. And
Yes.
the whole concept of let's experiment, let's see what things work best for kids and transfer the knowledge to other schools, not happening. Let's look for experimentation and innovation, not happening. And let's make sure that we're offering something unique and that the charter school mimics the diversity of the kids in the community. not happening. So I think that we saw, unfortunately, nationally and probably especially in North Carolina, I can vouch for, maybe well-intended beginnings that have gone way off the path. So a lot of us in North Carolina are saying maybe we'd like to have a moratorium on charters and take a step back and really do a careful evaluation of the information to see, is this working, and do we need to abandon it, or do we need to augment it and by making some real serious changes in how we're letting it operate. Right. So I think that, you know, that in the best of days, many of us want to say, let's take a break and let's come in and go back and look at our original intent and see if we can kind of reclaim that and make a better way. And because we are seeing the downside of segregation, and we are seeing the downside of having high poverty schools. And so that is alarming. So I know we're going to have to stop, but you see, at the beginning of the conversation, I warned Richard that the time will fly by because it'll be so intriguing and so interesting, and the information is so good that we'll get diverted. But I did want to show this last slide really quickly for anyone out there with your pencil and paper, so that you can, I do want you to look for some of these publications by Richard. And I do want you to go to Century Foundation and make sure that you, there's a whole lot of, I went too fast. Oh, there, I got it. This is the contact information. Richard is one of many people at the Century Foundation who are doing work in the K-12 area. So go check them out, because you're going to find other reports and research activities going on there that are going to intrigue you. There's a lot of good stuff you're doing on housing. So some of our elected officials may want to go and look there for some resources on housing and how that can help make more integrated communities, so we can have more easily integrated schools based on where we live and work and play every day. So we've already taken a lot of questions, but I'm going to give my end of the webinar spiel. You know the drill. I always like to say, please go to our website. We have a lot of information there. This webinar will be placed there we'll be putting it on YouTube later tonight, and it'll be up on our website tomorrow. So you can, if anyone missed it, or if you want to make sure your friends see it, share that with them. Please join, like our Facebook page and go to our website and join our newsletter. We send out our newsletter to over 100,000 people every week. And we want your input and your views and your articles and your information. We are standing strong in North Carolina, Richard, because 10 years later, we are still here to say that we believe in one system of strong public education that is integrated, innovative, well-funded, and serves all kids. In North Carolina, we're really proud. So remember that when you're doing your research, Richard. In our state constitution, we actually have written in our state constitution that every child deserves a high-quality, free public education. And so that's something that we, many of us feel like we've strayed from, and we hope that we can get back to, because we do believe that, and I know you do, Richard, from my conversations with you, from reading your work, that public education is a common good. And that, the common good is what we need to make sure that we understand, that decisions we make about our own children, they do impact all children. And that sometimes, putting the common good in the front of our decision making could be a better democracy and a better country for all of us, and a better future for our children. Richard, I could talk to you all night, and I know your family won't like that. Right. They're going to want you to get off the phone. They're probably wondering what you're doing in there.
Well, it's been a great pleasure talking with you, Yvonne. Thank you so much for having me on this program, and thank you for all the great work you're doing in North Carolina to strengthen high-quality integrated public schools.
Well, we're going to stick to it, and keep us in mind if you come up with suggestions or notions or things we need to read or things we need to share with our audience. please keep us in mind, because we want to continuously provide our. We believe in the concept of educated voters, and we believe in the concept of educated public education advocates. We want them to have right information and good information, and to make good decisions. And so you have a lot of access to that stuff. So send it on down here to us, okay? And we'll get it out.
Very good.
Okay.
All right. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Nice talking to you again.
Great to talk with
Bye
you.
bye.